So what's with the pre-workout chocolate? Chocolate has got so many different benefits, and the thing is with it that most of the different benefits that it exerts, they match up very, very nicely with pre-workout. If we're looking at things like dopamine stimulation or the slight vasodilation, the caffeinergic properties, these are all things that we want to get pre-workout. So the thing with dark chocolate, like if you look at this, I've got 100% cacao, which is pretty dark. I like to go at least 70, more like 80 to 100%. What you'll find is that there's a certain bitterness. It's almost like not palatable at all, but it's that bitterness, that astringency that we see often in nature, in natural foods. You got things like lemon rinds or any of this rind of the white pith of citrus fruits. You got garlic, you got your whole cruciferous vegetable family. So watercress, broccoli sprouts, horseradish, wasabi, all of these different plants with that astringency, that tackiness. Look at those tannins in red wine. They are indicators of the amount of phytochemicals and nutrients and the antioxidant properties of those foods. So that is part of the reason why those foods are so good for you. It's part of the activation of bitter taste receptors that you have, not just in your mouth, but down into your gut. So the research on this is still very, very, very new, but the studies show that stimulation of these bitter receptors, it does go downstream into the gut, which then feeds back into the brain via the vagus nerve, and it stimulates all sorts of health benefits, from decreasing inflammation to stimulating metabolic pathways for energy production. The list goes on. The thing is, cacao, or like the raw chocolate bean, it's got a lot of different polyphenols, phytochemicals, nutrients in it. So these are chemical compounds that exert different effects on the body. You'll find them a lot in different plant foods. Chocolate in particular, it's got a lot of tryptamine, theobromine, tyramine as well. And all of these different chemical compounds, they go down the pathway to help with producing things like dopamine, which is important for that reward, motivation, training drive, and focus. So these are all things that you want in your system building up through the training cycle. See, the thing with dopamine is your body typically releases it in response to some sort of reward stimulus to help to reinforce certain behavior. So it's your body, it's your brain telling you, I like this action that you're doing, keep doing more of it. This is why chocolate is so addictive in the first place. But if you time it properly and take it in pre-workout at some point, I usually do it maybe just on the drive over, you get this rise in dopamine. Now that can be a really beneficial thing. What's happening over time is I'm priming my dopamine system to give me that craving or that sensation of a reward in response to me training. So when I'm pushing that hard set, pushing through that pain barrier, or hitting new PBs in the gym, I'm getting that dopamine hit from the chocolate along with many other things to help with priming and reinforcing that action. Now for me, I like to have the chocolate pre-workout. One thing, because it tastes pretty good. I quite like the bitterness. It helps to wake me up a little bit more. Chocolate has been shown to have stimulatory effects, and it does have those effects on me. I don't really have caffeine or any stimulants outside of that. I don't have coffee that often. No pre-workout supplements. For me, a little bit of chocolate is all I really need. Even then, I don't really need it. But it also has a lot of other benefits in terms of things like blood pressure regulation, vasodilation, which is a really important one, particularly around training. People taking all these pump supplements, when I'm not saying chocolate is as good as those pump supplements, but it exerts a pretty similar benefit. Now, of course, you take a lot of citrulline, you're going to get a huge ass pump in the gym. However, something like citrulline or any of those compounds that work on the arginine response, they will also, as a byproduct, by upregulating arginine, they'll increase viral replication. Now, something I learned a little while ago from my friend Luke Lehman is that just about everybody has some sort of virus that's latent and living inside their body. Whether it's like shingles, chickenpox, Epstein-Barr or glandular, mono, or something like cold sores, the herpes viruses. Everybody has them, and they might not even be aware of it. So you don't necessarily want to be taking things that increase that replication of viruses, because it will be decreasing your immunity and it'll increase systemic inflammation. Looking at risk to costs, chocolate has very, very little costs to it and a lot of benefits. So eat up. So today is back training. It's actually nothing too aggressive. I pushed pretty hard on my lower body session a couple of days ago, and prior to that, 2 days prior to that, so my first back session of the week was my heavier lifting day. So compounding with that, I'm training back twice a week at the moment. There's one primary day and then there's one, I guess you call it secondary day. There is still some heavy lifting involved in that, but the intensity overall isn't as high in terms of the movement selection, the exercise selection. I'm using movements that don't require as much neurological output, so I can still lift heavy, but without creating as much of that systemic demand on my nervous system that'll impact recovery. The big thing I'm thinking about here is 2 days ago, I trained legs and I did about 2.5 hours of training. And my legs, they're not actually too sore at all. I've got a pretty good recovery rate at the moment. However, one thing that people forget about is locally, my lower body is fine, but systemically, my body is still recovering. It's still replenishing its nutrients, replenishing its stores, and trying to recover from that leg session. So I'm coming into this session in somewhat of a depleted state, despite eating properly and recovering as much as possible, just because I pushed the limits a couple of days ago. So because of that, this session, I know as much as I want to, I shouldn't push too hard because it will affect me in the next 2-3 days thereafter. And I'm meant to be deadlifting in 2 more days, and that's where I'm going to get the most bang for my buck out of my back development and out of my overall training. So for that reason, this session is still pushing hard, but with a different type of intensity and with different types of exercises to allow for better recovery overall. So I can still get in and stimulate some sort of hypertrophy response, but not tank my recovery rate because of what's happened earlier in the week and what will happen later in the week. Okay, so started today's training session with some wide neutral grip chin-ups. This is probably my favorite grip for hitting the lats in a chin-up. You'll see I'm doing these with a slight sternum emphasis as well, pulling up through the lower rib cage just to hit the mid and lower lat fibers a little bit more aggressively. So I'm doing sets of 3 to 5 here. I'm starting with sets of 5 and I'm working up just in 10-pound increments. I went 25, 35, 45, 55, 65, and then 75 pounds, hitting 5 reps. And then when I got to a point that I couldn't hit 5, I dropped the reps down to 3 and kept ramping up. Now, I think one of the most overlooked things when it comes to back training is hitting those lower rep schemes. It's very common to see people doing sets of 8, 10, 12, 15, etc., for their lat training, particularly things like pull downs or chin-ups, but they're not hitting sets of 3s or 4s or even as low as 2s and doubles for their back training, which is really missing a lot of untapped potential with their back development and motor unit recruitment. So you'll see here on these last 2 sets, when I get down to 3 reps, I added in some eccentric pauses on the way down. I added in 3 eccentric pauses just to add in a little bit more overload, a little bit more intensity to the exercise. Okay, so next up I'm doing the lower lat emphasized cable rows with this setup here. I'm doing these, it's actually called a telly row, invented by Jerry Telly a number of years ago. He wrote about these and many other movements in his book, Telekinetics. Now, essentially all it is it's emphasizing the eccentric portion. It's overloading the eccentric portion. You'll see on the way, as I pull, I'm leaning and swinging back to allow me to overload that portion, and then I'm holding it isometric as I rock my torso forward to overload the lats, particularly lower lat and mid-back fibers, in a range of motion in which they normally couldn't hold it if I was just to lock myself into one position for the pulling phase only. You got to remember there, you are stronger on the eccentric than the concentric. So these telly rows or these negative accentuated rows accentuate that. So I'll just did 3 sets here, similar kind of loading pattern, doing sets of 6 to 8 this time, working up in sets of 8 to the top weight, then bumping up the weight further and going towards sets of 6. Okay, so next up is the single arm dumbbell row lunge stance with a short stance. So the telly row, just done previously, and this dumbbell row here are both two movements that I'm using as more, I guess, isolation lat movements as opposed to the more heavy basic compound movements you might see that you would do on a more primary focused day. So as I said, this workout isn't my primary focus of the week. This is more recovery based training. I still do want to push hard, but I want to use movements like these here that force me into positions that are a little bit less stable, which will limit how much weight I can use. But at the same time, with the techniques, you'll see the supinated grip, you'll see the stretch across the opposite leg, and the instability of the short, close, narrow stance. These things all create more recruitment through the lats without me having to necessarily use more weight, which would present as more accrued volume and stress on the nervous system that might impede recovery. So for that reason, I'm doing this movement as opposed to supporting myself on a rack or a bench as you traditionally see. But do pay attention there to the way that the elbow doesn't fully stretch out and doesn't fully bend either, just to keep tension off the bicep tendons there and to help keep constant tension on the lats through the entire range of motion. Okay, final movement for the day is lunge snatches with the dumbbell. So upper back movement, rear delt movement, focused on thoracic mobility, thoracic rotation and extension. Really nice way to open everything up and create a nice pump across the entire upper back. This is both a mobility and stabilizing based movement as it is a hypertrophy one. It's not about load here. If you think about the triangle pose from yoga, or even like the bent press from old school strongman lifting, this movement emphasizes those sorts of regions through the entire side chain, the obliques, the lats, and of course that thoracic mobility and rotation, which is so important, especially considering the stuff that I'll be doing later this week with overhead presses and rack pulls. This is a section of the body that I do want to be waking up and priming throughout the week. And just a little bit of downshifting for the end of the workout. I like to do some sort of stretching. I love to do some sort of weighted hangs like this, just to open up the entire spine, decompress the spine, add a little bit of traction to the hips and the shoulders as well. This is probably one of my go-to things to do for shoulder health overall. I did a few sets of 1 to 2 minute holds just with straps. You'll see here I do a few leg raises as well. It's not particularly to train the abs, but more to add a little bit of extra traction through to the lumbar spine and the hips, to open up the lats through the thoracolumbar fascia a little bit further, and to maintain that hollow body position to stretch out the upper lats as well. So a few sets there just to really switch off and calm everything down post-workout. So today's session, pretty successful. As you see, it wasn't overly challenging overall. There was, about 15, 16 sets, and maybe about half of those were really pushing limits. The rest of it was, I guess you could call pump work or stimulatory work, and focusing a little bit more on mobility and to set up some adaptations for tomorrow's training. So tomorrow we're looking at doing some heavy overhead pressing. So I need to make sure my thoracic spine is articulating and moving in a particular way. So doing those lunge snatches at the end helps to prime that and give me a little bit of stability that will carry over neurologically to tomorrow. The big thing for me with this session, and I guess this whole cycle of training, is I'm looking at peaking on certain days. I'm training 6 days at the moment, and maybe only 3 of those days I'm leaving the gym feeling absolutely wiped. The other 3 days I'm leaving feeling better than when I came in. I'm feeling more upright, I'm feeling awake, alert, and filled out in the right areas, and I don't feel overly taxed or fatigued or tired, which is ideal. So the thing with this phase of training is I'm looking at peaking specifically on my deadlifting days, on my rack pull day, which is coming up in 2 days' time. So for that reason, today's session is not necessarily about slamming me into the ground, but it was more about stimulating the right muscles that will provide some more leverage for spinal stability in 2 days time when I go do my rack pulls. It's also setting up, like I mentioned before, a little bit of thoracic extension, thoracic mobility and stability through that region that will carry over well to my overhead pressing tomorrow for my shoulder work and a little bit of ancillary arm work. So what I want you guys to do is leave me a comment below and just tell me, with your training, are you planning things out across a week, across a month? And are you thinking about how each session blends in with each other, not just across one training phase, but maybe across a week? If you're not doing that, tell me why.